And the emphasis then of the SOAR teaching frames that we've developed for TK2 mathematics is around that academic language and literacy development of young kids in mathematics classrooms. And so one of the driving things that we looked at, right, is what do effective teachers who are working with young kids, what do they know? What are they doing in their classrooms? What kind of practices do we see there? How do we recognize the kind of practices that are effective when we see them? And then this is the notion of strategic observation and reflection. How do we use this knowledge to really support the professional growth of teachers who work with young English learners? So we talk about these professional growth systems, and this is again the big broad view. We know that when we're helping teachers actually know how to grow in their practice, there needs to be some common language and some target. So we picked out instructional shifts that sort of fit with the new California framework. And we also looked to cultivate communities of teachers, mentors, and coaches using the frames so that they can share peer-to-peer, and creating the conditions for them to engage in that strategic observation and reflection. So, you know, it's especially challenging as we've worked with pre-K and TK teachers. Where's the time for them to come together? Where are the supports and resources to allow them to share? So thinking about how we help districts or other organizations create those conditions to allow teachers to have that peer-to-peer time. And we have, as I said, worked with over 40 partners, mostly from the state of California, but some districts like Boston that we work with outside the state of California. So when we looked at them, we were looking at teacher growth and student growth. So we thought about how the frames could be used and target the learning that the new California frameworks emphasize, and also those early learning progressions that we looked at. How teacher growth would be measured in terms of things like the California standards for the teaching profession, and how we're making sure that we're really thinking about academic language and literacy development integrated with content. And I talked about this, so I'm not going to spend too long, but this is that notion of grain size. When you articulate a tool that teachers can use, it has to give them some concrete direction for growth. If it's too broad, like I said, engage students in learning, or too narrow, put a language objective on your board, right? That's not really helpful for giving them direction for growth. So we tried to develop the SOAR teaching frames to give teachers direction for their professional practice growth. So these are the TK2 practices. You have a handout. And Bob's going to go a little deeper into one of our frames, and we're going to look at a video so you can see what we're really concretely talking about. But there were 5 practices that came out of all the work we did as really important for young students learning mathematics and for the development of their academic literacy. Acquisition of those foundational numeracy skills, which we know is central. Helping students communicate their mathematical understanding, both orally and in writing. Having discussions with each other and collaborating, talking about the mathematics. The idea of developing those thinking processes, how to problem solve, inquiry, even from the very youngest stage all the way up. And then perseverance, which we see a lot about in mathematical contexts, how to keep pursuing problem solving, adjusting approaches, and we know that's very important to start to develop that idea of perseverance in our youngest kids so that they can carry that up through the grades. So that's kind of 50,000-foot look. Bob's now going to take you into a frame, show you some videos, and share some instructional strategies to give you a more concrete idea of what we're really talking about.
Okay, so these practices were one of the key things that emerged from the research we did. The other key finding, or one of the other key findings from the work that we did that emerged, was that these 5 practices don't work in isolation. Each one is supported by and works interdependently with what we call cross-cutting and foundational practices. And the high-impact cross-cutting and foundational practices together form what we call a teaching frame. So each teaching frame has one of the high-impact practices, one of these, right? So for the sake of our conversation here this afternoon, we're going to use communicating mathematical understanding as our sample to get you into it. So we have that high-impact practice. That is supported by 3 cross-cutting practices. The first is facilitating acquisition of academic language. There's certain language connected to mathematics and learning in general that many kids, whether they're English learners or native speakers of English, come to school lacking. Right? Another key cross-cutting practice for us is fostering metacognition. So this is that reflective, introspective perspective that all good learners, whether they're in kindergarten or 12th grade or lifelong learners as adults, have. But many kids lack, and there are things we know about metacognition that can be shared and taught directly with kids to help kids develop this. And this is, for us, a very important cross-cutting practice. And the third one is monitoring and guiding learning, right? How many of you have been teachers in the classroom, right? No matter what you're teaching, no matter what the grade level, if you're a good teacher, you got to be walking around, you got to be monitoring what kids are doing, you've got to be constantly keyed into this. And when necessary, making adjustments in what you're doing in the classroom. So these 3 pieces together form our cross-cutting practice, and these are supported by the foundational practice of designing instruction. So what you see here is one of our teaching frames. Imagine that instead of communicating mathematical understanding, we had one of these other practices. We had mathematical discussions at the top. Then we'd be looking at the teaching frame of mathematical discussions. So we have 5 high-impact practices, which means we have 5 teaching frames. I got to go on, but I need some reassurance. Are you with me? Yes, you see the connection here, yep? Yeah. So the next important thing to understand is no matter what the high-impact practice is, the cross-cutting and foundational remain the same. Okay? They remain the same. Although it's important to realize that if I'm fostering metacognition for the purposes of communicating mathematical understanding, how I do that could be different than fostering metacognition for mathematical discussions. But the practices remain the same. Okay? Right? We all get. All right. So this is just a little bit more detail. Each of these practices breaks down into what we call elements. When we're talking about communicating mathematical understanding, there's a lot of verbs, a lot of words up here, but provide and support multiple guided opportunities for students to produce and fortify oral output. Right? Oral output to communicate mathematical understanding. So the difference between this one and this one, the first one focuses on oral output. The second one focuses on written output. Right? We want kids speaking and expressing their understanding or their questions. We also want kids to be able to write about that. So that high-impact practice focuses on both of those pieces. When we talk about facilitating acquisition of academic language, obviously we're supporting students, and that's many people think about this as important for English learners, but again, there are many native speakers of English in school who need support with academic language. And just the one thing I'll very quickly say, because time is short, is that when we work with teachers, one of the things we've learned is that we have to reinforce for folks that academic language is more than vocabulary. Right? There are other pieces to it. It's the syntax of the language, how sentences get constructed. It's the message level Am I trying to persuade you about something? How cohesively are things tied together? So academic language is vocabulary, but it's also syntax, and it's also this message level. Fostering metacognition is what I referred to quickly just a minute ago, this idea of being a reflective, introspective learner and being able to use strategies. So if I'm trying to solve a math problem and I'm having trouble, do I just give up? Which in effect is a strategy, but not a very effective one. We want kids to have a broader range of strategies to choose from and some understanding of which strategies work in which situation. So we have to teach kids that. And that falls under this practice of fostering metacognition. Monitoring and guiding is just what we said, and foundational talks about establishing learning targets that are connected to the Common Core and creating activities that have rigor and high expectations. So that's a more detailed view of a teaching frame. Right? So, oh, yes, thank you. Sorry. Let me pull this out and let me say one thing about this. So at the top of this paper, you see the high impact practice, and we call these elements, the bulleted items under each one. So I'll just point out now, we're not going to take time to talk through these, but each bullet under each practice is what we call an element, which gives you more explanation of what I've tried to kind of summarize for you in the last 2 minutes. So this is just a more detailed version of what we've been talking about, okay? We want? Okay, we're going to ask you to watch a video. This is from the teaching channel. This is what the lesson plan is from?
Yeah, exactly.
So you have, another one of your handouts is the lesson plan. How long, do we know how long it is about? Okay, this is 7 minutes, and this is a first grade classroom that has a high number of English learners, and she is going to be providing opportunities in this video for kids to orally and in writing share their understanding. And we want you to look at this, look for examples of this, and if you happen to notice them, is there anything related to academic language development? Do you see anything about the way the teacher is monitoring the students? So I'm just...
I'm sorry, what?
I know that this class has lots of knowledge that they're ready to share.
I don't think you're going to understand that because the
And I know
video
that we know how to
situation
have
was
really
messed
good
up for the audio.
sessions.
So yeah, okay, that's fine. All right.
Welcome, first graders. Today we get to do something super exciting. We're going to do a number talk together. My name is Julia Gellermino. I teach first grade at Think College Now Elementary. Today we're going to get to show all of our mathematical thinking, all the things that we've been learning about counting on
What?
and adding numbers. Today's lesson was about using a number talk, which is basically a short routine that you can do 3 to 4 times a week. This particular number talk was a dot talk, so they're using those dots and grouping them in different. Nice. And how did you figure that out?
Using my brain.
Okay, you used your brain. And what?
Okay, this is a really good video, and in the lesson plan, it gives you information about it. So if you want to go to the teaching channel and view the whole thing, you'd be able to do that. Just for the sake of us moving forward, we've got 10 more minutes, so we're going to cut off the end of it. But could you see some things here? Opportunities, supported and guided opportunities for oral output, supported and guided opportunities for written output. Yes, I mean, and again, ideally we we had built in time for you to talk to each other and share about this. But yeah, I'm getting by the nods of heads, you all, obviously some of these opportunities may be more nuanced. There were opportunities related to other aspects of this frame. So remember that the little girl at the end who said 6 and it was really 7? So I mean, on one hand, that was that teacher monitoring and guiding and getting that girl support. It's also fostering metacognition, asking her to, she didn't just say, no, that's wrong. She said, think about this. Will you go back and think about it again? So that whole interaction with that child around 6 instead of 7, I mean, that was an example of this fostering metacognition. Right? So, and these were, I mean, examples of the evidence that we saw, and this is in your PowerPoint slides that you have, just all of these things are evidence of the different practices, okay? So what we want to do in the 8 minutes we have left is share some instructional strategies that teachers can use in class and parents can use with kids to help them develop their ability to communicate mathematical understanding.
And so this one we don't, you know, you can go to the teaching channel.
Here, wait.
Hand out the, oh yeah, sorry. So we handed out the lesson plan. She has worksheets. If you go to the teaching channel and just search up Dot Talks, you'll find all of her resources. But Number Talks, how many of you have done Number Talks in your classroom or Dot Talks? These are a great way to get young kids talking about mathematics. And if you Google Jo Boaler, if you know Jo Boaler, she is from Stanford University. She has a website called UCubed. She has a wealth of resources from very little kids all the way up to secondary of how to facilitate number and Dot Talks. So the lesson plan and those will give you resources for doing this, but these are a fabulous way to get your kids talking about mathematics. Oh, Bowler is J-O is her first name. Last name is B-O-A-L-E-R. And she's done some fantastic work and has some videos on there to show you how to do Dot Talks and Number Talks with very young kids.
Okay, so the next activity we have, you have that green sheet that says Chalk Talk. Pull that out for a minute. And oops, this slide gives you some information about it, but before we get into that, I'm going to go ahead. I want you to see this picture. This, you know, forget the directions, forget the words on the page. This is a visual of what a chalk talk looks like for young kids around math. Now I put these pieces of paper up because we were going to engage you all in a chalk talk, which we won't do right now. But it's a silent activity. There is no talking, which has its own advantages sometimes, right? So, their kids are given a prompt. So here, can you see this as what is math? You see that in the middle there? That's the prompt for that chalk talk. This one, what do you do when you get to a challenge in math? So the prompt could be virtually anything that's relevant to your instruction with the kids. And what kids are asked to do, they're given a marker and to write a response. And so you can kind of see, you see these lines that represent this child's response to that prompt. And this one actually is interesting because it looks like different kids may be writing at the same time. You can control that. You can do it that way, or sometimes there are advantages to just having a single marker and it passes around and it's more like a conversation that way. And then, let me see if it's more visual on this. You can't, well, the point here is that if this child here is writing, he or she is writing the lines down. Now, if this child could just respond to this prompt or could respond to what this student wrote and draw a line then from him to her. That makes sense? Yeah.
they do it less with words and more with pictures oftentimes. Other ways teachers get them to actually cut out pictures and stick, they use that to stick it on there. So there's different ways. So if you do Chalk Talk in Google with preschool, you'll see a whole host of visuals. Actually, Instagram and Pinterest are fabulous because they just give you lots of pictures of different Chalk Talks for very young kids.
And what's on this slide are just an example. We're taking our number of the week, and I've written, as a teacher, a couple of prompts, and students, you can let them, I prefer letting them do it because you want them to be more comfortable with the prompt, so you might have more than 2, you might have 3 up there, and they get to do that. Does the idea get, yeah, I mean, this is a great activity. It's really fun, and a lot of learning attached to it. We're going to have you write about that. That's maybe not as much fun. So anyway, we're going on here. So this is the last one. We've got 3 minutes here. So this is called an interview grid. This is certainly not none of these are activities that Susan and I developed. They're just out there in the world, and people have used them. And an interview grid is something that's been around for a long time. So basically, usually, students are given, oh, thank you so much. This is that sheet that's in your packet that's relevant here, right? And so each kid would literally have a piece of paper, this piece of paper, and walk around and, what's your first name? Amber. So I'm Amber and I, the problem is 10 times 20. How am I going to go about solving that? I write down my thoughts before we start the interview, and then I'm walking around, and I make my way over to Amber, and that's interview number 1. So I write down how Amber would solve this problem. And then I go to interview number 2, write down that student's response, right? And then you see my thoughts again at the bottom. So after I've had the interaction with these other kids, I can step back and think about, do I still think my way at the beginning was best? Do I want to change it at all? So, again.
Another way to do that is thinking about very young kids is there's a great other teaching channel video, which is literacy in ELA, but it's TK. So she has 4 and 5-year-olds in there, and she's asking them about factor opinion. So rather than having them write, she has a structure for them talking to different kids about factor opinion. In math, I've done it where they talk about patterns, and it's building stronger understanding so they can talk to one kid and then go to another and then share out. So you can do it orally.
No, we've also had kids walk around with a tally sheet. We'll have like a question on it and say, who likes sunflower seeds, if we're studying sunflowers or whatever the case may be, and not try to walk around and ask each kid and do a tally mark, yes or no, and then we'll go back and count and which one had more, which had less. So, yeah, with younger ones, 3 and 4-year-olds.
Such like a short time for the presentation, less than 30 minutes, I think. But we do have at epfteach.com a lot of the resources that we put up around the teaching frames and for earlier grades. And we also know that the teaching channel for any of these strategies is a great source of resources. So other than that, I think any questions that you might have quickly? Okay, thank you. It's like the speediest presentation ever.